The McLaren 720S sat motionless in the garage bay like an abandoned million-dollar sculpture. Adrian folded his arms, his voice carrying the weight of a final verdict: 6 months. $180,000, non-negotiable. Charlotte stood straight, her expression revealing nothing, but her fingers tightened slowly around the key pressed into her palm. In the far corner of the shop, a man in a faded coverall, hands dark with grease, glanced up at the car for exactly 3 seconds, then bent back down to his work without a word. He said nothing, but his eyes had seen everything. What was hidden behind those grease-stained hands? Keep listening. The truth you are about to hear will change everything you assumed. Pinnacle Auto Works didn't look like a garage, it looked like a promise. Glass facades caught the morning light and threw it back in clean white sheets. Polished concrete floors reflected the silhouettes of cars most people only ever saw in photographs, and the titanium logo above the entrance had been commissioned from a design firm that charged more per hour than most mechanics earned in a week. The staff moved in coordinated black uniforms, pressed and unhurried, trained to project the particular competence that high-net-worth clients paid for before they ever handed over a key. The shop held authorization agreements with 11 supercar manufacturers. Its waiting list for new clients ran 4 months. In the neighborhood it served, the kind of zip code where net worth was a topic discussed in conference rooms rather than living rooms, Pinnacle wasn't just a service center. It was a statement about the kind of person you were. Elijah had been there for 3 years. Not because he needed the position the way most people needed a paycheck, though the paycheck was useful. He needed the work, the specific, tactile, immediate version of it. He was on his back beneath a Porsche 911 when the morning shift began that Tuesday, working through a brake caliper removal with a precision that looked almost effortless, the kind of fluency that only comes after 10,000 repetitions. His coverall was faded to a pale gray blue, the collar worn smooth at the fold. His toolbox was old, military green paint chipped at the corners, one hinge replaced with a mismatched silver latch. But the interior was organized with a discipline that would have impressed a surgeon, every tool in its designated slot, every surface wiped clean, the drill bits sorted by diameter in a machined aluminum tray that definitely had not come with the box. He spoke to no one unless spoken to, and even then kept his answers short and clear. He didn't complain, he didn't share opinions about management. He arrived before his shift started and left when the work was finished. And in 3 years not a single person at Pinnacle had thought to wonder what had brought him there. Adrian ran the shop with the easy authority of a man who understood that the real product was confidence. He had stopped doing technical work years ago. His hands were clean, his suits well fitted, his handshake rehearsed into a form of art. His value was in the certifications framed behind the front desk, the referral network he had spent a decade building, and the precise way he could make a client feel simultaneously important and in capable hands. He passed Elijah's bay that morning without slowing. No acknowledgement, no eye contact with the man lying beneath the Porsche. Just a voice angled toward the floor. Porsche needs to clear the bay by 5. The words weren't instructions. They were the kind of reminder you left for a reliable piece of equipment. Owen worked the adjacent bay, a man with a genuine laugh and the settled confidence of someone who had made his peace with who he was and what he did. He'd spent enough time beside Elijah to understand the informal rules of the arrangement. Elijah didn't initiate conversation, and that was perfectly fine. Just after noon, Owen stopped by with 2 paper bags from the diner across the street, the kind of place that had been on that corner for 30 years and hadn't changed its menu once. Doing a lunch run, you in? Elijah shook his head without looking up. Owen set one of the bags on the corner of the toolbox anyway, the kind of small gesture that didn't require acknowledgement and wasn't asking for any. Elijah's life outside the shop was organized along the same lines as his toolbox. A second-floor apartment 4 blocks away, facing an alley that caught afternoon light through one window. A shelf of technical manuals whose spines had cracked from use and been repaired with electrical tape. A coffee maker always half full, no photographs on the walls, no objects that served no function. He had built the space the way a person builds a space when they are not trying to remember anything and not trying to forget anything either, just trying to get through the day with the particular quietness that follows a loss too large to be spoken about to anyone who didn't already know. He had been living that way for 5 years, and the garage had become the anchor of it. The afternoon was winding down when the flatbed rolled into the lot. The McLaren 720S it carried was the color of platinum under cloud cover, a gray so precise and so specific that it looked engineered rather than chosen, which of course it had been. The effect on the shop was immediate, voices lowered, movements slowed. A few technicians drifted toward the bay door with the magnetic pull that exceptional machines exert on people who spend their lives around machines. Adrian emerged from the back office in under a minute, his posture recalibrated entirely, back straight, the practiced warmth of professional anticipation in his face, already in the mode that top-tier clients required. Charlotte stepped down from the passenger side of the tow truck's cab. She had not been in the McLaren when it failed. The car had lost all drive engagement on the highway 60 miles out, multiple error states lighting the cluster simultaneously, and she had pulled onto the shoulder and waited with the patience of someone who had long ago accepted that events do not always accommodate schedules. She wore a navy blazer over a dark blouse, her phone already in hand, and she described the failure to Adrian in the precise language of someone who had been briefed well and had listened carefully. Sudden loss of drive engagement, no mechanical warning in advance. Full instrument cluster fault display, no response from throttle input. She was not distressed. She was informative. Adrian received her account with the grave nodding of a man for whom every problem presented was an opportunity to demonstrate the weight of his expertise. The diagnostic cart arrived beside the McLaren within the hour. Two senior technicians in clean uniforms, Adrian's best presentation pair, the ones he put in front of VIP clients, connected the interface cable and initiated the scan. The equipment cycled through its read, pulling error codes from every accessible module, and both men leaned over the screen with the appropriate body language of professional concern. Measured head shaking, low consultation voices, the particular posture of men who wanted to be seen processing something complex. The scan itself took 12 minutes. What it returned was accurate as far as it went. A cascade of fault codes across the ECU, transmission control modules, the kind of display that looked alarming to anyone who wasn't trained to read beneath the surface layer. Adrian delivered the assessment in the reception area, standing at a slight angle to the printed estimate sheet as though they were reviewing it together, a technique that made the numbers feel collaborative rather than imposed. The car's engine control unit had experienced a critical firmware fault, he explained, compounded by a mechanical failure in the dual-clutch transmission actuator assembly. Parts of this specification could not be sourced locally. They would need to come directly from the manufacturer's supply chain in Woking, England. Lead time on components at this level was typically 12 to 14 weeks. Adding assembly, calibration, and road certification brought the total timeline to approximately 6 months from intake to delivery. Inclusive of parts, labor, storage, and post-repair certification, would be $180,000. Charlotte did not move. Her face did not change. She looked at the estimate sheet, at the itemized columns, at the signature line at the bottom, and then she looked at Adrian and asked the only question that mattered. Is there any way to accelerate this timeline? Adrian shook his head with carefully calibrated regret. This was the certified process, he said, the one approved by the manufacturer, the one that protected the engineering integrity of the vehicle and the validity of its warranty. To deviate from it would be to accept risk that he could not in good conscience put his shop's name behind. He said it fluently because he had said it many times before, and each time it had worked. Charlotte took the estimate sheet. She reviewed it twice, once for content, once for the absence of anything she might have missed, and then she signed at the bottom. Not because she was satisfied, she was not satisfied. She signed because Pinnacle held the exclusive regional authorization for service on this vehicle platform, and without that authorization, an independent repair would void the remaining manufacturer's warranty. The signature was a practical decision made under constraint, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. Across the garage floor, Elijah had straightened up from the Porsche. He was at his workstation wiping down a torque wrench when his eyes moved once, one controlled, looked to the diagnostic screen left visible on the cart beside the McLaren. He didn't cross the floor, he didn't alter his expression or his pace. But in the time it took him to read the fault display from 40 feet away, His mind had already completed the assessment that the shop's senior technicians had stopped at the surface of third-layer ECU firmware conflict, triggered by an overwrite during a remote update push, not a hardware failure, not a parts failure, a software conflict in the powertrain management stack that could be corrected with a firmware rewrite and a calibration reset. The transmission actuator reading, positional error consistent with contaminated hydraulic fluid, metallic particulate from a missed service interval lodging in the pressure regulation valve. No replacement parts, no 6 months. He was still looking when Adrian noticed him. The shop owner crossed the floor with a smile that hadn't reached his eyes, the smile of a man who had just secured a significant contract and had no patience for complications. Elijah, the voice was light, almost friendly, but pitched to carry in the way of a man who wanted an audience. Admiring the new arrival? That one's a bit out of your lane. Let's focus on finishing up the Porsche. He held eye contact for exactly long enough to make the point, then turned back toward the reception area. Elijah nodded once. He turned back to his workstation without a word. Charlotte, walking toward the exit, caught the exchange. The economy of it. The way Elijah had received the public correction and simply returned to his work without any visible reaction, without the wounded posture that usually followed that kind of remark. There was no submission in it. There was no suppressed anger either. There was something else, something she didn't have an immediate word for, the quality of a person who found the exchange not hurtful but simply irrelevant. She held on to that observation for a moment longer than she expected to, and then Diana touched her elbow and reminded her about the 4 o'clock call, and she walked out of the shop. At the door, she paused. She turned back to Adrian, who was already moving toward his office, and said, "You're certain there's no one here who could do this faster?" Adrian smiled the way he smiled when he was closing. "Miss Charlotte, this is a McLaren. The level of specialization involved is exactly why we're the only certified facility within 300 miles. 6 months is what doing it right looks like." She received this as information and walked out. The shop emptied by 6:30, the front desk locked. The reception lights went dark one panel at a time, and the parking lot cleared out in the unhurried sequence of men with no particular reason to stay. Owen was the last. He paused at the side door with his jacket over one arm and looked back at Elijah, who was moving between the completed Porsche and the parts storage wall at the back. "You heading out?" Owen asked. "I have a few things to finish up." Owen knew the Porsche was done. He had watched Elijah run its post-service check himself 2 hours earlier. He considered pressing and decided against it. 3 years of working beside this man had given him enough of a read to know when a question would be answered and when it wouldn't. "All right," he said and pulled the door shut. Elijah waited until the last set of headlights had cleared the lot. Then he walked to the McLaren and stood in front of it. He didn't touch the car. He stood in the column of white light from the overhead technical lamp, the only source of illumination left in the shop, and looked at the diagnostic screen still connected to the car's OBD port. The error log was exactly as the technicians had left it, the session still open. He read it the way a person reads something familiar in a foreign language, not with effort, but with the specific attention that comes from knowing the material deeply enough to read between what the words say and what they mean. Third-layer ECU firmware conflict. He had seen this class of error in at least 6 field cases during his final 2 years at Vortec, had reviewed the build reports when the vulnerability was first identified, had read the internal communications when the decision was made to push a corrective update to affected vehicles. The update had introduced its own conflict in the powertrain management stack, not in every vehicle, but in those with a specific combination of build date and regional dealer software environment. Charlotte's car matched every parameter. The transmission actuator fault was mechanical and required nothing except time and correct procedure. The dual-clutch hydraulic fluid showed all the indicators of an extended service interval. Metallic suspension from normal clutch pack wear, elevated viscosity breakdown markers. The pressure regulation valve would have particles in it. The positional sensor was reading a false error because the valve body was not moving cleanly, not because it had failed. A full hydraulic flush component clean, an actuator recalibration through the control unit's relearn protocol would restore the system to full specification. He could perform both corrections, the firmware rewrite and the transmission service, in a single, uninterrupted work session with the right equipment. He stood in front of the car for a long time without moving. He had spent 5 years building a life on the principle of non-intervention, not because he had stopped caring about things, but because he had needed, after the years that preceded this one, to exist inside a smaller radius. His wife had been sick for 18 months before she died. The illness had dismantled the architecture of the life they had built together piece by piece. And when it was finished, he had looked at what remained and understood that the rebuilt version needed to be different. Quitter with fewer edges for things to catch on, he had left Vortec on a Tuesday, driven home, and begun the process of becoming someone who fixed things with his hands and asked nothing of anyone and expected nothing in return. Pinnacle had been the third garage he had worked at since leaving. He had not intended it to be a permanent arrangement. But standing in front of this car tonight, with the full knowledge of what had been told to Charlotte and what it was going to cost her in time and money, the silence he had chosen became a different kind of choice. Not the clean withdrawal of a man protecting his own peace, but a passive endorsement of something he knew to be wrong. That was a line he had never been comfortable with, even in the years when comfort was the only currency he had left. He picked up his phone. He found Charlotte's contact information on the intake form saved in the shop's customer tablet, to which he had access as a senior technician. He looked at the number for nearly a full minute. Then he dialed. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was guarded in the way of someone receiving an unknown number at 9 in the evening from a shop that had just taken possession of their vehicle. Elijah introduced himself in the fewest useful words, his name, his position at Pinnacle, his presence in the shop that afternoon. Then he said, "I can fix your car. I can have it done within 24 hours. The silence on the other end was not confusion. It was the particular quality of attention that intelligent people give to unexpected information, the rapid interior calculation of probability and risk. "Are you certain of that?" she asked. "I've worked with this fault before," he said. "The car doesn't need new parts. It doesn't need 6 months. It needs someone who knows where to look." A shorter pause this time. "If you're wrong, I'll know." "Yes," he said, "you will." She told him to proceed, no demand for credentials, no request for elaboration on his background. He understood why. It wasn't carelessness. It was the trained recognition of someone who had spent a long time distinguishing between confidence and performance, between the person who needed you to believe them and the person who simply knew. She had heard the difference. He set the phone down on the workbench, looked at the car for a moment, then walked to the parking lot and opened the trunk of his own vehicle. The hard-sided case he lifted out was not the property of a standard mechanic. A professional-grade ECU interface programmer capable of deep-access firmware operations across 17 powertrain architecture families. A high-resolution automotive oscilloscope with a full set of input harnesses. A hydraulic flush and pressure calibration kit for dual-clutch transmission systems, the kind used by drivetrain engineers in controlled test environments rather than service bays. A set of precision Allen drivers in a machined aluminum tray, each worn smooth at the grip from 10,000 hours of use, and at the top, secured by a rubber band, a hardcover notebook in dark blue, pages dense with handwritten calibration parameters, correction protocols, field notes dating back almost a decade. He had carried this case to every job he had held since the day he left Vortec. He had not opened it in front of anyone at Pinnacle, not once. He set up his workstation without hurry. Without urgency. Urgency was for people who were working at the edge of their knowledge, and he was not. He connected the interface programmer to the car's diagnostic port and ran a full deep access log, pull, far below the surface layer that Pinnacle's scan tool had reached. What came back was precisely what he had read in the error display that afternoon, now confirmed in complete technical detail. Third-layer firmware conflict in the powertrain management module, specifically in the drive engagement authorization stack. The overwrite had been introduced during an automated update push to this vehicle's build class. The original calibration file was still partially intact in a protected memory partition, which meant reconstruction from scratch was not necessary. He needed to write a corrected parameter overlay into the management stack and clear the conflict, flags in the correct sequence. He opened the notebook to a specific page, a firmware correction protocol he had developed in collaboration with the Vortec engineering team and the manufacturer's field liaison in 2019, during the original fault investigation for this build-class vulnerability. He read through it once, fully, not because he had forgotten it, but because precision required that you never assume memory is infallible. Then he began. At 11 o'clock, the side door opened. Owen stood in the frame, helmet in hand. He had left it on the shelf by the parts window, hadn't noticed until he was halfway to the intersection. He stood in the doorway and absorbed what was in front of him. Elijah at the McLaren. The programmer connected and active, the notebook open on the workbench, the overhead lamp repositioned at the exact angle of a man who had done this operation before and knew precisely what he needed to see. Owen had worked beside Elijah for 3 years. He had seen him rebuild brake assemblies, diagnose ignition faults, strip and reassemble a Lamborghini Urus differential in 4 hours without reference material. He had thought he understood what he was looking at. He understood now that he had not. Elijah, his voice was careful. What are you doing? Getting someone's car back to them. Owen stepped closer, slowly, and looked at the equipment on the workbench. The programmer's interface showed firmware architecture maps that bore no resemblance to the diagnostic tools Pinnacle used, layers of system architecture rendered in technical notation that was its own language. He looked at the notebook, the handwriting close set and certain, pages and pages of it going back through what looked like years. Where did you get all of this? A long time ago, Elijah said without looking up. Go home, Owen. Owen stood there for another full moment. He looked at the programmer. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the man. Then he walked to the far wall and switched on the secondary corridor lamp, the one that ran along the side of the bay and added fill light to the work area, the one nobody turned on because it used more electricity than it was worth. It wasn't much. It was something. He picked up his helmet and walked out without saying anything else, pulling the door shut carefully behind him. Elijah worked through the night. The firmware correction was complete and committed by 2 in the morning, the parameter overlay written cleanly into the management stack, the conflict flags cleared in sequence, the post-write validations cycling green across every checkpoint. He disconnected the programmer, ran a module health check through the car's own diagnostics, confirmed the correction had been accepted without residual error states, EKEY resolved. He moved to the transmission. He drained the dual-clutch hydraulic system into a catch pan and examined the fluid under the work lamp. Dark metallic, the color of engine oil too long in service. He worked through the valve body with a solvent kit and the patience of someone who has done this particular task in varying configurations more times than he can accurately count, cleaning each component of the pressure regulation assembly, inspecting each surface for wear or damage, finding none. The actuator was intact. A full seal inspection showed wear within normal service parameters. He flushed the system with fresh fluid, reinstalled the valve body to specification, torqued each fastener to the value written in the notebook, and initiated the recalibration sequence, adaptive reset protocol, transmission control unit relearn cycle, actuator position calibration through the full range of travel. At 4 in the morning, he attempted a first engine start. The McLaren's engine responded immediately, full, rich, the high-register exhaust note of a naturally aspirated V8 filling the quiet shop and then settling into a composed idle. But the transmission control unit had not yet completed its relearn cycle. He noted the remaining parameter offsets, made the adjustments in the calibration interface, and let the system complete a second full cycle while he sat on the plastic chair beside his workstation and watched the oscilloscope trace the actuator feedback signals in real time. Dawn came through the high windows the way it always did in that building, gray first, then the light finding the dust in the air and making it briefly visible, then the flat white of a clear morning coming through the glass. Elijah had not slept. He had not eaten since the bag Owen had left on his toolbox the previous noon. He made coffee from the machine in the staff break room and drank it standing in the orange glow of the heating coil, not thinking about anything in particular, the way a person stands when they are very tired and the work is nearly done and there is nothing left to do but let the last cycle run. By 2 in the afternoon, every recalibration sequence had completed to full specification. He started the engine and let it run for 25 minutes, watching coolant temperature, Oil pressure, transmission fluid temperature, and actuator feedback in real time, everything held. Every parameter sat inside its target range without drift. He engaged drive and reverse through the full sequence on the jack stands, confirming actuator response through both gear ranges. He ran the diagnostics a final time. Clean across every module, the car was not approximating correct function, it was correct. Elijah shut the engine off. He disconnected his equipment piece by piece, coiled each cable carefully, returned every tool to its exact position in the case, and closed the lid. Then he sat down on the cracked plastic chair, the one with the bad back leg that everyone avoided, and drank the last of the coffee, cold by now and tasting of the burnt residue at the bottom of the pot. He looked at the car. 19 hours. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Charlotte's number. The car is ready. You can come whenever you like. Her reply arrived in 4 minutes. She would be there within the hour. She pulled into the lot in 53 minutes, Diana in the passenger seat, the two of them walking into the shop with the unhurried efficiency of people who had come for a deal, specific purpose and intended to complete it. Elijah was at his workstation, equipment case closed, and standing beside him, coverall removed and folded on the bench. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who had finished a task and was prepared to account for it. Charlotte walked around the McLaren once without speaking. Then she opened the driver's door, seated herself at center, adjusted her position, and started the engine. The sound was immediate and complete, a clean, high note from the exhaust that filled the bay and then settled into a composed idle, not the tentative sound of a machine returning to function but the full, certain sound of a machine that had not lost what it was built to do. She held the ignition for 15 seconds. She shut it off. She got out and turned to face Elijah directly. How long? She asked. 19 hours, he said. The shop door opened. Adrian walked in at his habitual time, moving through the interior with the automatic confidence of a man on his own ground, already building the morning's priorities in his head. He came around the corner of the reception partition and stopped. Charlotte, standing beside the McLaren that had been scheduled for a 6-month storage and rebuild. Diana behind her, tablet in hand, standing at his workstation with a closed case at his feet and no visible concern about any of it. Adrian crossed the floor quickly. His voice was controlled but had not had time to be fully composed. There was an edge underneath, the professional register that his training hadn't quite smoothed out in the seconds available to him. He turned to Elijah and delivered the formal language of process violation with technical precision. Unauthorized intervention on a client vehicle, circumvention of the service authorization framework, direct violation of the liability structure under which the garage held its certifications, exposure of the business to legal risk that he would not be able to mitigate after the fact. Every word he used was technically accurate. Every word was also a performance of a concern that had a different origin than the one being stated. Charlotte let him finish. Then she said, I want an independent inspection today. He couldn't refuse. A refusal stated in front of the client would have produced a worse result than the inspection itself, and he knew it. He made the call. The inspector arrived from a third-party automotive assessment firm within 2 hours, deliberate, methodical, the kind of professional who moved through a vehicle as though the machine itself were a document to be read rather than a test to be passed. He spent 45 minutes with his own equipment, full diagnostic sweep, firmware log review, fluid sampling, actuator range testing, visual inspection of the valve body and hydraulic components. When he finished, he assembled his report and handed it to Charlotte first, as she had requested. The vehicle was in full operating condition, every parameter within factory specification. The firmware correction was properly documented and correctly implemented. The transmission system had been serviced to a standard the report characterized as above average for a vehicle at this mileage. The hydraulic fluid condition better than the typical output of a scheduled dealer service. No evidence of improper intervention, significant evidence of skilled intervention. Adrian's line of argument changed. The technical ground had closed against him, cleanly and without ambiguity, in a written report from an independent assessor. He moved to the remaining available position process. Elijah had worked on a client vehicle without authorization outside operating hours, without supervision in violation of his employment agreement. These were facts. They were also in this room on this morning the last ground he had. Charlotte turned to face him. She had not raised her voice once. She had not moved more than she needed to. She spoke in the tone of someone reading from a document they have reviewed carefully. You presented me with a 6-month repair timeline and a cost of $180,000 for a firmware conflict and contaminated hydraulic fluid. She let that sit for a moment. I'd like to understand which part of that estimate reflected the certified process and which part reflected something else. Adrian opened his mouth. The pause that followed lasted just long enough to say everything the pause was capable of saying. Diana set her tablet flat on the service counter and turned the screen outward. She had started her background research the previous evening, shortly after Charlotte had described the late call from an unknown number at the garage. She had worked through most of the night. What she had found was organized with the neatness of someone who had expected to use it. 3 patent filings at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, all with Elijah listed as lead or co-inventor the second, filed in 2017 and granted in 2019, covered a firmware architecture for third-generation powertrain control systems, specifically the management of drive engagement authorization stacks in high-performance dual-clutch applications. The third, granted in 2021, addressed calibration recovery protocols for dual-clutch transmission management under compromised hydraulic conditions. Both had been licensed by the vehicle's manufacturer. Both were integrated into the engineering baseline of the 720S platform. The man who had been standing in the corner of the garage floor the previous afternoon, the man Adrian had corrected publicly for looking at the wrong car, had co-written the engineering foundations of that car's drivetrain. Diana had also found Elijah's employment record at Vortec Dynamics, 11 years, the last 6 as lead engineer of the Powertrain Systems Division. His team had overseen field fault resolution on more than 200 active cases across multiple vehicle platforms during his tenure. In 2018 and 2019, his division had led the failure analysis investigation that identified the exact firmware, build class vulnerability present in Charlotte's car, and had developed the correction protocol, subsequently issued to affected vehicles by the manufacturer. He hadn't looked this fault up last night. He had written the solution for it years before the car was sold. The room held its silence for a long time. Outside, a car passed on the street. The oscilloscope on Elijah's workbench ticked through its standby cycle. Owen was standing near the side entrance. He had come in during Elijah's account and stayed near the door, listening without interruption, his face carrying the expression of a man absorbing a revision to a picture he had thought he understood. Adrian spoke first because the silence was no longer working for him. His composure had held through the inspection, and through Charlotte's statement, and through the patents. But composure maintained under sustained pressure has a quality that genuine steadiness does not. It is structural, held in place by effort rather than ease, and eventually the structure requires more maintenance than it can provide. He turned to Charlotte and stated his final position. Whatever the history, whatever the credentials, the relevant facts of the present situation were that Elijah had performed unauthorized work on a client vehicle without current certification in this context, without liability coverage for this operation, and without the knowledge of the authorized service holder. These were factual statements. They were the last wall he had, and both of them knew it. Elijah set down the handle of the equipment case. He spoke for the first time since Charlotte's arrival, the same voice he always used. The same measured pace, the same absence of theater or grievance. He looked at Charlotte, because she was the one the information was for, and he walked through the diagnosis in full. The third-layer firmware conflict, what it was, how it had been introduced, why a surface-layer diagnostic scan would present it as a hardware failure rather than a software conflict. The actuator fault, the mechanical origin, the hydraulic fluid condition, the reason cleaning and recalibration restored full function without any replacement parts. The absence of any parts requirement whatsoever. The reason none of this was unusual knowledge for someone who had been working with this architecture before the vehicle existed. Every claim was verifiable against the evidence already present in the room. The firmware programmer had logged each step with timestamps. The correction record was stored in the vehicle's own module memory. The hydraulic fluid sample was still in the catchpan. There was no distance between what he said and what could be confirmed. Adrian took his last position one more time. He looked at Charlotte and said that no reasonable business operation could function if employees unilaterally overrode its protocols based on personal judgment, regardless of personal background. That was a standard no certified service center could maintain. He said it with the tone of a man appealing to shared principles. He said it because there was nothing else left to say. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She looked at Elijah, not with the evaluating look of someone still deciding, but with the confirming look of someone checking a conclusion against the evidence. Then she turned back to Adrian. "He fixed my car in 19 hours, she said. That is my answer." She requested a written confirmation from the independent inspector that the vehicle had been assessed and cleared. He provided it immediately. She informed Adrian that she would be withdrawing her ongoing service agreement with Pinnacle, removing the shop from the preferred vendor list maintained for her company's executive vehicle, Fleet, and requesting a full refund of the intake deposit paid the previous afternoon. She said it the way she had said everything that morning, without elevation, without drama, as information delivered to a person who needed to have it. Adrian said nothing. He had run out of words. Charlotte walked to the exit. Diana followed, collecting the inspection report from the counter, with the efficiency of someone crossing a completed item off a list. The shop door opened and let in a clean bar of morning light and then closed again, and the sound of Charlotte's sedan starting in the lot came through the glass front panels, and then the car moved out of the lot and the sound faded. Elijah picked up his equipment case. He looked across the shop at Owen, who was still standing near the side entrance. Owen looked back. He wasn't wearing the expression Elijah had half expected, not shock, not the wounded look of a man who felt he had been deceived. He looked like someone absorbing a revision to a map he had been navigating confidently for years, only to find that a significant portion of the terrain had not been on it. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked. The question was genuine, not accusatory. Elijah considered it honestly. It wasn't relevant until it was. Owen nodded. It was the only answer that actually fit, and both of them recognized it. There was nothing else that needed to be added, and so neither of them added anything. Owen walked to his car, the lot cleared. The shop was quiet in the particular way of a space that has just finished containing something significant and has not yet decided what to do with the vacancy. Elijah walked out into the morning air. It was cool and clear, the sky a pale even blue. Charlotte was waiting beside her car, not inside it, standing at the driver's door with one hand resting on the frame, the other at her side, her phone not visible for the first time since he had first seen her step down from the tow truck, cab. She looked like a person who had made a decision and was waiting for the last piece of it to arrive. She didn't speak immediately when he came out. She gave him the space to arrive and then asked, "Why are you here?" He understood the question entirely. Not the geography of it, but the substance, the real version she had been carrying since Diana's tablet had turned on the counter with the patent filings open. Why was the man whose name was on the engineering documents of this car's drivetrain working a floor job at a garage in the city? He set the case down. "I needed something I could finish," he said. "Work where the result was in front of you at the end of the day. I had years of work where that wasn't the case, and I needed time away from it." She heard it. She didn't comment on it, didn't offer the sympathetic formulation that lesser people would have defaulted to. She was a person who had her own understanding of what sustained high-pressure work extracted from a person over time, and she was not in the habit of judging the ways people managed their recovery from it. "My company is expanding," she said, "fleet logistics and high-end vehicle operations management. I need an independent technical consultant, someone who can evaluate service claims, assess vendors, set maintenance standards for the fleet. It isn't a full-time position. It isn't a fixed schedule. It's a phone call when the situation needs someone who actually understands what they're looking at." Elijah held her look. The offer was delivered without pressure and without performance, the same directness she had maintained through the entire morning. The same quality he had recognized in her from the moment she signed the intake form, not because she was convinced, but because she had no other option and wasn't pretending otherwise. He had not met many people who were entirely comfortable with the full, unadorned truth of a situation at all times. He didn't answer immediately, she didn't push. Owen came through the side door and saw them. He stopped, assessed, then walked over when Elijah caught his eye. Elijah extended his hand. Owen shook it, and the handshake held a moment longer than courtesy required. 3 years of shared daily work in it, and the specific weight of a revised understanding. Neither of them felt the need to speak to it. Owen walked to his car. The lot was quiet. Elijah looked at Charlotte. The car didn't need 6 months, he said. It needed someone willing to actually listen to it. Charlotte was still for a moment, the particular stillness of a person hearing something that confirms what they already knew. In 15 years of running a company, she had met many people who were very good at the appearance of competence. She had met far fewer who were this comfortable with the actual thing, who carried it without announcement, without the need for recognition, who would apparently have been content to let it remain invisible if staying visible had not become its own form of complicity. "Is that a yes?" she asked. There was the faintest shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but the thing adjacent to a smile that a person allows when the answer is already known to both parties and the question is more ceremony than inquiry. "I'll think about it," he said. He picked up the equipment case, walked to his car, and placed it in the trunk with the same deliberate care with which he had placed it there on every other day for 3 years. He pulled out of the lot without hurry, and Charlotte watched his car turn the corner and disappear into the ordinary traffic of the city. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the empty lot. Then she got into her own car and drove back toward the city center, and the morning continued around her the way mornings do, indifferent to what had just happened, indifferent to what had been set in motion. 2 weeks later, Elijah sent Charlotte a message of exactly 1 sentence. He would take the consulting arrangement. She read it standing at the window of her office on the 14th floor, looked at the city below for a moment, and put her phone in her pocket without forwarding the message or discussing it with anyone. Some conclusions don't require commentary. They simply require the right series of events and the right people willing to see them through.